The icy winds of Leor 3 howled like tormented spirits, sweeping across jagged obsidian ridges that stretched endlessly into the horizon. Captain Eric Halen, battered and broken, collapsed to his knees, his survival suit systems screaming with urgent warnings. The cracked visor of his helmet was smeared with his own blood, a crimson streak that obscured his vision and added to the surreal, nightmarish quality of his surroundings. His breaths came shallow and ragged, each one tearing at his lungs like shards of glass. Pain surged through his body as he struggled to stay conscious, the desolation around him swallowing his cries for help. Above him, a storm roared ominously, its approaching dust clouds promising to engulf him in its unrelenting fury. Eric's mind flickered with memories of the ambush that had led him to this dire situation. The reconnaissance mission had been routine at first, a simple mapping of the hostile terrain to prepare for the Alliance's forward operations. Then the scifistories had descended. The alien predators, their exoskeletons gleaming like obsidian knives and movements orchestrated with hive-like precision, had overwhelmed his team. The air had been filled with the cacophony of their shrill clicks and the desperate screams of his crew. Eric had fought valiantly, buying his people enough time to retreat, but the scifistories had overrun him within minutes. Paralyzed by their venom and battered by their relentless assault, Eric's consciousness had slipped away as his team's evacuation ship disappeared into the swirling storm clouds. By all rights, he should have been dead. Inside the fragile safety of Camp Delta, Commander Lila Farn stared at the perimeter monitors, her expression taut with guilt. The camp, a grid of hastily assembled modules and flickering shield generators, offered scant refuge from the lethal environment of Leor 3. Around her, the crew's morale was as shattered as the landscape outside. Each of them carried the weight of Eric's loss, not just as a commanding officer, but as a friend who had held their chaotic unit together. Lila's second-in-command, Rafe, approached cautiously, holding 2 steaming mugs of Kelrit tea. "Anything on the scanners?" he asked, his voice subdued. Lila accepted the tea with a slight nod, her eyes never leaving the monitors. "Just rocks and storms. Nothing alive out there." Her tone was bitter. "Not for long anyway." Rafe hesitated. "You made the right call," he said quietly. "We couldn't risk the whole crew for a dead man." Lila snapped, her voice harsher than she intended. "That's what he is, right?" The two lapsed into an uneasy silence, the only sound the distant howl of the wind outside. At the edge of the storm, Eric Halen stirred. Pain greeted him like an old, unwelcome adversary. His survival suit's diagnostics were a chaotic mess of red and yellow alerts, but one warning blared louder than the rest. Oxygen critically low. Gritting his teeth, Eric forced himself upright. The scifistories, seemingly satisfied with their kill, had left him for dead. Their venom had numbed his limbs rather than ending his life. Perhaps a quirk of human biology they hadn't accounted for. It was a sliver of fortune he wasn't about to waste. Through the cracked visor, he spotted a faint glimmer in the distance. Camp Delta's shield dome, barely visible through the swirling dust. The distance wasn't far in linear terms, but the journey ahead was fraught with treacherous terrain and the ever-present threat of predators. Eric scavenged what he could. A jagged piece of rock to serve as a weapon, scraps of fabric from his suit to bind his wounds. Every step forward was an act of defiance, his body screaming in protest as he trudged across the alien wasteland. The first night was merciless. The temperature plummeted, frost forming on Eric's visor and joints seizing in the cold. He found shelter in a shallow cave, barricading the entrance with loose rocks to keep out nocturnal predators. Using his suit's damaged power pack, he managed to spark a rudimentary fire. The dim, flickering light offered little warmth, but enough solace to keep despair at bay. Sitting by the fire, Eric's thoughts turned to his crew. He pictured them back at Camp Delta, grieving his loss and moving forward without him. The thought brought a wry smile to his cracked lips. He wasn't ready to become a memory just yet. As dawn broke, Eric's journey resumed. His progress was agonizingly slow, each step requiring every ounce of willpower he could muster. The scifistories were relentless hunters, and their presence was never far. He could hear their eerie clicks echoing through the canyons, a reminder that he was being stalked. Navigating a narrow canyon, Eric found himself on a precarious ledge. Below, a group of scifistories scuttled into view, their iridescent shells catching the weak sunlight. Eric held his breath, clinging to the rock face as they began to climb toward him. "Not today," he muttered, forcing himself to ascend faster. Loose stones tumbled into the abyss as he scrambled upward. Reaching the top, he crossed a natural rock arch just as it began to crack beneath his weight. The pursuing scifistories were not as fortunate. The arch collapsed, sending them plummeting into the void. Eric didn't pause to celebrate. Survival demanded he keep moving. By the time Eric reached the outskirts of Camp Delta, the sun was setting, casting the landscape in hues of deep orange and purple. His battered form staggered into view, silhouetted against the glowing dome of the camp shields. Inside, alarms blared, and the crew rushed to the monitors. Lila's eyes widened in disbelief. "Impossible," she whispered, her voice cracking. But it was him. Eric Halen, bloodied and unyielding, was walking straight toward them. The gates opened, and the crew spilled out to meet him, their shouts of astonishment blending into a cacophony of relief and joy. Eric managed a faint grin as he collapsed into their arms. "Miss me," he rasped before darkness claimed him again. When Eric awoke, the sterile hum of the med bay surrounded him. Pain throbbed through his body, but the fire of indignation burned hotter. His eyes snapped open, locking onto Lila and Rafe standing nearby. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice raw but cutting. He struggled to sit up, waving off their protests. "You left me out there. You left me to die." Lila flinched, her defenses rising. "We didn't have a choice," she argued. "There were no life signs, Eric. The storm—" "Don't," he interrupted, his tone icy. "Don't tell me about choices. I made mine when I stayed behind to buy you time. You didn't even check. You just wrote me off." The room fell silent, the weight of his accusation hanging heavily in the air. Finally, Lila's shoulders sagged. "You're right," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "We failed you. I failed you. What happens now?" Eric leaned back against the bed, his strength momentarily spent. Now we make damn sure this never happens again." In the days that followed, Eric's determination galvanized the crew. He led expeditions to study the scifistories, uncovering patterns in their behavior and signs of a larger ecosystem at play. They discovered that the scifistories were not the apex predators of Leor and 3. There were larger, deadlier creatures lurking, and these behemoths pose an existential threat to everyone on the planet. Through painstaking effort, the crew managed to establish a tenuous truce with the scifistories, using their knowledge to prepare for the battles ahead. When the first behemoth attacked, the humans and scifistories fought side by side, their combined efforts bringing the colossal creature down. As the dust settled, Eric stood on the camp's outer wall, watching the scifistories retreat to their territory. One paused, locking its iridescent eyes onto his. In that brief moment, a strange understanding passed between them. "Do you think they'll stick around?" Lila asked, stepping up beside him, Eric's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe they've decided we're not worth fighting anymore." Lila smiled faintly. "That's progress, I guess."